Welcome to NED's China podcast hosted by Cosmos.
I think President Xi is a very smart guy, and I think we'll end up making a very good deal for both. But, you know, we've been treated so badly for so many years.
US-China relations dominate the headlines. US strategy towards China has shifted, and the great power competition is the new approach. What is the logic behind imposing significant tariffs towards China? Which areas of trade are the most critical? How relations between US and China affect third countries? How Russia fits in the equation? Also, what about the port of Piraeus? What are the dangers in having a Chinese company controlling a port? To discuss these issues, we have invited Matthew Krenning, Vice President of the Atlantic Council and Professor at Georgetown University. I'm your host, Mαριλίζα Αναστασοπούλου. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here with us today at the Cosmos NED's China podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Professor Krenning, before we start our discussion, I would like to ask you, you work at the Atlantic Council, you're very important there. Could you tell us a bit about the Atlantic Council so the listeners can understand what this is about?
Sure, it's one of the oldest and now largest nonpartisan foreign and defense policy think tanks in Washington. We were founded in 1961 by two former secretaries of state to focus on the big strategic issue at the time, transatlantic relations and the Cold War. Since then, we've grown a lot, so we cover every issue in the world, including China, with our 300 full-time staff and almost 600 non-resident experts. So again, one of the largest think tanks in Washington.
That is great. And we're going to be focusing on US-China relations. I mean, you're an expert on international security and nuclear weapons, but we're going to have a more general discussion about US-China policy. And I would like to ask you, before we go to today, to give us a brief, let's say, history of US-China relations, because they have changed a lot. I mean, the perspective the last couple of decades.
Yes, well, and I direct a global strategy and security program at the Atlantic Council, and China is the number one challenge facing the United States right now. So I do spend a lot of time thinking about China. And our strategies changed in recent years. You know, going back to the end of the Cold War, I think there was this optimistic, maybe even naive view that if we engage China, let it into the World Trade Organization, that it would become wealthier. As it became wealthier, it would become more democratic. As it became more democratic, it would become more cooperative on the world stage, almost like it would become a big Germany or Japan. And that didn't work. Instead, we saw that over time, China was moving in the opposite direction, becoming more repressive at home, more aggressive internationally. And so in 2017, the United States formally announced that there was a change in strategy and that great power competition with China was going to be the new approach. And I think there's been a lot of consistency from Trump 1 to Biden and now to Trump 2 on this recognition that we need to compete with China.
Yes, I understand that there's bipartisan support when it comes to China. It has been quite clear, but nonetheless, Trump's administration, second administration, has a different style. So let's start, for example, with the tariffs. I mean, we see this ongoing, the tariffs going up and down, and now they're negotiating. I think they're supposed to conclude negotiations by August, if I'm not mistaken. Could you give us your perspective on that?
Well, this is one of the biggest challenges posed by China in the economic domain, because there are unfair trade practices. And so China steals intellectual property from the West. It puts restrictions on the ability of Western companies to do business in China. So there's not fair and free market access. And so traditionally, tariffs are one tool that countries have to offset unfair trade practices and to try to force the other side to the table for a negotiation. So I do think that's Trump's hope here, is that with the tariff pressure, that this will convince China to come to the table. to negotiate and with any luck, get China to open up to a freer and fairer trading regime.
Yes, but we had the public discourse it was quite loud, but as far as I understand, there were negotiations on the side quietly, respectfully, let's say, the one country to the other. Are you optimistic that there's going to be an agreement that it's going to be beneficial worldwide? Because there's this idea also that in the same time, international trade has been harmed, that there's no stability, that investors are in shock. So how optimistic are you that we're going to have a good deal, let's put it like that?
Yes, well, when it comes to the United States and its allies, like the European Union, I am optimistic that we can get to some kind of an agreement. And we've already seen a US-UK agreement, for example. When it comes to China, I think it is going to be much more difficult because China's not a free market economy, and really its entire economic model has been built on unfair trade practices. And so really getting China to stop that would mean possibly the end of the Chinese Communist Party and a very different China. So I think finding a negotiated settlement to the China economic issues is going to be very difficult. So I suspect that this kind of slow decoupling we've seen from the United States and the Chinese economy, but also de-risking from the European Union and the Chinese economy will likely continue.
Which areas are most critical when it comes to the trade between US and China? I mean, we're not talking about the T-shirts. I mean, we even talked about the T-shirts and putting tariffs on the small parcels, but these are not the critical areas, I'm sure. Could you please describe which areas you think are the most critical?
Yeah. Well, to just give one concrete example of how the problem of increased or too much economic interdependence with China, a few years ago it was reported in the Washington Post that an American software company developed software that would simulate a wind tunnel that the Pentagon could then use to test hypersonic missiles. But it was a private software company that developed the software. They applied for an export license to sell this to China, and it was approved. And so presumably right now, China is building weapons to kill Americans, financed by the American taxpayer. That doesn't make sense. And so that's why I think the United States, the European Union, other free world countries do need to de-risk from China in these sensitive areas relevant to national security. So military issues, but also other critical supply chains, technology, infrastructure. But other areas, I think free trade can continue. If the West wants to sell agriculture to China, that's fine. If they want to buy cheap made in China T-shirts.
Could you give us also your opinion when it comes to the rare earths? That has been a lot of discussion. We saw what happened with Ukraine, with the deal of US with Ukraine. How important is it and how dangerous is it?
Yes, this is another area where we're too vulnerable to Chinese supply chains. And so over the past several years, China's come to dominate the rare earth market. Mostly because the processing of rare earths is very dirty when it comes to the environment, and China was less concerned about that, and we were happy to have China do the processing to spoil their environment and not ours. But now we've realized that we're too dependent on those supply chains, and so there is a recognition that this is a problem and a move to find other sources for rare earths. So you mentioned Ukraine as an example. We've seen Greenland in the news as a possible solution. And one idea people are discussing is to have a stockpile of rare earth elements, kind of like we have a strategic petroleum reserve in the United States, so that if there were some kind of crisis and China cut off our access to rare earths, there would be stockpiles available.
I'm going back to the general US trade issue, and I'm just reading now the title of one article on Financial Times. US-China trade war is pushing Asian nations to pick sides, ministers warn. So I'm going into a more general idea that since the US is trying to convince its partners that they shouldn't trade with China in some critical issues, but there is the fear that those countries, some countries, might choose to trade with China and stop trading with US. I'm just putting it plainly. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that it's not just the United States pushing other countries or companies to de-risk from China. I think they've come to understand the risks for a number of reasons. So a number of companies are pursuing what they call a China plus one strategy. So if they used to produce in China, they're maybe not shutting down those factories, but they're not opening new factories in China. They're opening them in Southeast Asia or Latin America or elsewhere. And so I think we are seeing this move out of China. And so I don't think countries are going to choose between the United States and China. And because of these tariffs, if European countries do less business with the United States, what I'm hearing is that they're talking about doing more business with Canada or Japan or Latin America, but I don't think there's any eagerness to do business with China because I think they understand the risks.
Okay, I'm going to another issue now that you also testified before the U.S. House Committee on Homeland Security on China's strategic port investments in the Western Hemisphere. You talked mainly about Peru and Panama, if I'm not mistaken. Nonetheless, in Greece, we also have a port that it's very important to us. COSCO, a Chinese company, has invested in there for many years now. And the question is, how dangerous is it? I mean, what is the danger of having a port that there is China influence and control there?
I do think that Chinese control and operation of ports in Greece and Panama and elsewhere does present a threat to the United States, but also to Greece. And so one is the intelligence concern that everything flowing through those ports is China's picking up a lot of data, and that's all going back to Beijing. And I know one issue that would be of interest to Greece is presumably that's data that could also be shared with other countries in the region, maybe neighbors where Greece wouldn't want that information being shared. A second is economic coercion, that in the event of a crisis or some policy issue where China disagrees, they could threaten to restrict access to the port or shut the port. And we've seen China use economic coercion in other areas, shutting down South Korean department stores, for example, when South Korea took a decision on missile defense that China didn't like. And then worst case scenario, in a major conflict between the United States and China, which is unfortunately a realistic possibility that maybe we'll get to. You know, would China decide to shut down the port altogether, which of course would have important and negative economic implications for Greece and for many others?
I see the danger after that. Let's go a bit to the area, to our area. When I say our area, from Greece, I'm talking about Greece. And you know that we have the issue of Ukraine because it's in our continent. Now, it has been argued, and until now this is the way it has been projected in the news, that compared to other countries, Trump has been, let's say, softer towards Putin. He called him crazy the other day, but in general, the whole, the way that he has dealt with Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been softer compared to other countries worldwide. And the question is, why is that? If you believe that it is softer, A. B, why is that? Some people might argue that maybe it's a way of, he was thinking that getting Russia closer to the US is a way of getting Russia further from China. That's one argument. I want your opinion on that. And I want also your opinion on, since we see the US being, let's say, distant when it comes to Ukraine, how do you see the whole issue developing with Europe now trying to advance its military capabilities?
Yes. Well, let me challenge.
Yeah, it was 3 questions, sorry for that.
No. Well, first, if we look back at the first term, Trump's first term in office, he was often kind of deferential to Putin in his language, But the underlying policy, I would argue, was actually pretty tough on Russia and pretty good for Europe. And so I think we might see something similar here again, where he does seem unwilling to criticize Putin, but he's calling for NATO allies to spend 5% on defense, which would greatly strengthen NATO, including former Soviet bloc countries. And so that's not something that Putin would like. And then when it comes to Ukraine, I don't think that Trump has some master plan to work with Russia against China. I think, as he said over and over again on social media, he just wants to stop the killing. And his strategy, I think, has been to first pressure Zelensky to negotiate, and I think that's succeeded. Zelensky seems to be negotiating in good faith. And now we see the problem is Putin, and so will Trump increase the pressure on Putin? He has threatened sanctions and tariffs, and so I hope that those are coming next, because I do think it will require getting tougher with Putin to get him to negotiate in good faith.
So let's go to a hypothetical scenario that Putin doesn't do any deals, continues to attack Ukraine, and decides to attack another NATO country. And at the same time, we see, for example, China attacking, invading Taiwan. Is there such a scenario? Is there a fear of having multiple wars at the same time? And how do you see US reacting?
It is a fear of the Pentagon right now that you could have simultaneous conflict because if Putin has been very clear that he wants to revise the security architecture in Europe and is willing to use military force to do that. And also China has been very clear that it wants to take Taiwan and it will be willing to use military force to do that. And the United States can only do so much. So if there were some kind of conflict, say in Europe, and Xi understood that the United States was tied down in Europe, would he just sit on the sidelines, or would he think this is an opportunity for me to finally take Taiwan? Or vice versa, if there's a conflict in the Indo-Pacific and the United States is distracted, does Putin see an opportunity to attack a NATO ally? So I do think this is a very dangerous moment in international security, maybe the most dangerous we've faced since World War II. And the challenge for the United States and Greece and our other allies is how can we deter and, if necessary, defeat China and Russia at the same time?
Okay, one last question. We covered the defense part and the trade issues. We saw now, I'm going to the social educational issue, which was quite interesting. I mean, we saw what's happening with Trump and Harvard. And it was quite interesting to see that on top of everything else, it has alleged that Harvard has links to the Communist Party. I mean, that comes as a surprise to many that are totally unaware of how many Chinese students are in the US. But could you comment a bit on that?
Well, China is pretty clever in the way that it uses its economic leverage for control and political influence. And I think that's true in universities here in Greece, but also in the United States. And so a lot of Chinese students are studying in the United States, unlike American students who often get scholarships or some kind of financial aid. Chinese students often pay the full cost of tuition. And so it is a big source of revenue for U.S. universities. And so for that reason, they're unwilling sometimes to get tough with China because they worry about what that could mean for the revenue streams. I think we're seeing similar things here in Greece, with many Greek universities signing up for partnerships with China, Confucius Institutes, or other things that in the short term may seem like a good deal because they get subsidized Chinese language classes, but it does come at a cost. China uses those programs to push its propaganda and to really, I think, miseducate a lot of people in terms of what China stands for on the world stage.
So we should be cautious a bit about what's going on around us. Basically, this is what you're saying. I mean, Greece does have a good relationship with China. I mean, Greek people are quite friendly and don't have any, let's say, are not hesitant when it comes to China. But it's true that from what we see and from all the human rights violations that go under the radar right now, it's a very interesting topic to follow, and it's a very, we should all be a bit cautious about it. Thank you so much. I will wrap it up here because I think we covered most areas, unless if you would like to add something when it comes.
Well, just one final comment, if I may, because you said that the Greek people don't see a problem with China. And so let me push back on that, because I do think that China is maybe the greatest threat the free world has faced in a long time. It's much more capable than the Soviet Union ever was. It is a dictatorship with very different values than Greeks' traditional values. It's engaged in genocide. It's systematically stealing intellectual property and wanting to dominate technology of the 21st century. And so what does the world look like if a genocidal dictatorship controls 21st century technology? And it's planning to attack a vulnerable democratic ally in Asia that could lead to World War III if there's a major war between the number one and number two economies on Earth. That would be very bad for the prosperity of the people of Greece. So I do think that China poses a direct threat to the security, prosperity, and freedom of the Greek people. But other than that, it's not a problem.
Thank you very much for your time. It has been really enlightening.